So, when you hear about amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, we often get bogged down in all this complex biology, right? But what does all that stuff at the cellular level actually mean for a person's body? Well, in this explainer, we're going to bridge that gap. We're going to connect the microscopic world of the disease to the very real lived experience. So, let's dive in.
So that's really the big question, isn't it? How does a tiny, microscopic problem with a few cells, how does that snowball into such profound, life-altering changes in the body? We're going to trace that journey, right from the invisible cause all the way to the visible effects that, impact pretty much every aspect of physical function.
All right, so here's our game plan. First up, we'll connect biology to body. Then we'll look at what happens when nerves go silent. After that, we'll get into this tale of two neurons. It's super interesting. Then we'll talk about how the disease spreads. And we'll wrap up with something really important, what ALS doesn't take.
Okay, so first things first, let's lock in this core idea. You can think of it like this. Imagine a single frayed wire in a huge electrical grid. At first, it's just one tiny problem, but eventually, it can cause a power outage for an entire neighborhood. That's kind of what we're looking at here. This tiny cellular breakdown in ALS eventually leads to these huge, widespread consequences for the body.
All right, let's get right to the heart of it. When you boil it all down, ALS is really about one single fundamental problem, the progressive loss of what are called motor neurons. Think of these as the absolute command and control center for every single voluntary movement you make.
So what is a motor neuron exactly? Well, the easiest way to think about them is as the body's internal messengers. I mean, every single time you decide to do something, walk across the room, say something, even just blink, it's a motor neuron that's carrying that command from your brain, shooting it down your spinal cord, and telling that muscle, hey, move. They are literally the bridge between your thoughts and your actions.
Okay, so it makes sense then, right? If these messengers, these motor neurons, start to disappear, the signals they don't get through. And the immediate result of that? Muscle weakness. Suddenly, things that were completely effortless now take a huge amount of energy, which leads to this really deep, pervasive fatigue. And it's often those really fine, delicate movements, like buttoning a shirt or writing, that are the first to become a real struggle. And this whole process, it happens in a really clear sequence. So step one, you have a healthy neuron connected to a muscle, everything's working fine. But in ALS, that connection gets cut. That's a process called denervation. Now, what happens to a muscle that stops getting signals? It's kind of like an abandoned factory. The machinery's there, but no orders are coming in, so it just sits there and eventually starts to shut down. That's what we call atrophy. The muscle shrinks. And what's so important to get here is that the muscle itself isn't the problem. It's just been completely disconnected from its command center.
Okay, now here's something that can be really confusing about ALS. You might hear about someone experiencing symptoms that sound totally contradictory. Like, how can a muscle be both stiff and weak at the same time? It seems impossible, right? Well, the answer is actually pretty fascinating, and it all comes down to the fact that we're dealing with two different types of motor neurons.
So, let's break this down. First, you have your upper motor neurons. These guys start up in the brain. When they get damaged, the result is spasticity. That's that muscle stiffness or tightness. Then you have the lower motor neurons. They run from the spinal cord out to the muscle itself. And when those are damaged, you get the classic weakness or flaccidity and also those little muscle twitches you might see called fasciculations. Now here's the kicker. ALS attacks both types, and that's exactly why someone can have a limb that feels incredibly stiff but is also profoundly weak at the very same time.
All right, so we've kind of covered the what, the symptoms themselves, but what about the how? How does this disease actually spread through the body? It turns out it's not random at all. There's a very real pattern to how it progresses.
So almost always the disease kicks off in one specific spot. For the majority of people, we call it limb onset. That just means the first signs of weakness pop up in a hand, an arm, or maybe a leg. But for some others, it's what's called bulbar onset. And for them, the first difficulties are with the muscles used for speaking or swallowing. But the key takeaway here is it starts locally. It starts in one place.
And from that starting point, the way it spreads isn't a roll of the dice. It moves methodically. It follows the brain's existing motor networks. A really good analogy is a fire spreading through the electrical wiring of a house. It's not just jumping from room to room randomly. It's following the paths that are already there. And that's exactly what happens here. The spread just follows the built-in, interconnected map of our nervous system.
Now, as the disease progresses, it inevitably reaches the muscles we use for breathing, and the main one here is the diaphragm.
And just like any other muscle in your body, the diaphragm is completely dependent on motor neurons to get its signal to work. So, as those neurons are lost, breathing naturally becomes harder. And something else happens. The ability to produce a strong, effective cough gets weaker. It's all a direct result of that same core problem we've been talking about this whole time.
Okay, so for this final section, we're going to shift gears. And this is maybe the most important part of this whole conversation. We've spent a lot of time talking about what is lost, but it's absolutely crucial to understand what is preserved. So, let's talk about what ALS doesn't take.
And here is the absolute key distinction. ALS is a motor system disease. The nerves that do the opposite job, the ones that carry signals from your body to your brain, the ones for touch and pain and heat and cold, those sensory pathways are completely separate, and for the most part, they are left untouched. This means the ability to feel the world, to feel a touch, it all remains.
And that leads us to maybe the most profound truth of all. Because the disease is so focused on the motor system, a person's cognitive function, their consciousness, their awareness, it's all preserved. The mind, the personality, the very essence of who they are, that remains completely intact.
And so we're left with this incredibly powerful and very human question. It really gets to the heart of what it's like to live with this disease. You see, understanding all the biology, that's critical, for sure. But really grasping this reality, that's what opens the door to true empathy and real insight.